The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the dimly lit hospital room as the heart monitor beeped in slow, steady intervals. On the pristine white sheets lay an aging millionaire, his breath shallow, his time slipping away. By his bedside, a golden retriever whimpered, its glassy eyes locked onto the man's frail hand. This was their final moment, a silent goodbye that no wealth in the world could prevent. The hospital room was unbearably still. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, a cruel reminder that time was slipping away. Outside, the world moved on. Cars hummed past, rain drizzled against the window, and people walked without knowing that a life was about to fade into silence. Inside, on a stark white hospital bed, Richard Langley, the man once hailed as a financial titan, a self-made millionaire, now lay motionless, his skin pale, his breath a fragile whisper. The tubes and monitors that surrounded him, once symbols of medical hope, now seemed like mere accessories to the inevitable. But Richard wasn't alone. At the foot of the bed, a golden retriever sat, ears drooped, amber eyes locked onto his owner with unwavering devotion. Charlie had been with Richard through it all, the empires built, the battles won, the mistakes made. And now, as the final chapter unfolded, Charlie refused to leave. A nurse stood at the door, watching the silent exchange. She had seen families rush in during final moments, seen lovers cling to each other in desperate grief. But this was different. There was something about the way the dog sat, patient yet deeply aware, that made her chest tighten. She had heard stories of dogs sensing when their owners were slipping away, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. Richard Langley had once been a man of great stature, powerful, ruthless in business, untouchable. His fortune had been amassed through decades of calculated decisions, his name synonymous with luxury and exclusivity. Yet despite the world knowing his wealth, very few knew the man beneath the tailored suits and boardroom victories. His life had been built on acquisitions and expansions, but in his final days, the only presence by his side was not a board member, not an heir, not even a friend. It was Charlie, the only soul who had loved him without conditions. A weak murmur escaped Richard's lips. His fingers twitched slightly, reaching for something unseen. Charlie, sensing his owner's struggle, stood on his hind legs and placed his front paws gently on the edge of the hospital bed. His nose nudged Richard's trembling hand. The contact seemed to ease something in the old man. His fingers curled around the soft fur, a ghost of a grip that was both desperate and resigned. The nurse took a step closer, her voice soft. "He's been waiting for you." Richard's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze, once sharp enough to dismantle business empires, now held only weariness. But when he saw Charlie, a faint smile flickered on his lips. A breath shuddered through his frail body, and for the first time in days, his expression softened. A past memory flickered behind his tired eyes. Charlie as a puppy, tumbling across the manicured lawn of his estate, his tiny paws too large for his body. The day he had brought him home, Charlie had been a gift from a colleague, a joke almost. "Maybe this will teach you to care about something other than money," they had said. Richard had scoffed at the idea then. Now, as the weight of his fortune meant nothing, he realized Charlie had been the only thing worth caring for all along. The beeping of the monitors continued, unchanging, as time pressed forward. The nurse stepped back, giving them space, watching as Charlie rested his head against Richard's hand. The old man's breaths were labored now, slower than before. His lips moved slightly, forming words without sound. The past clawed its way into his consciousness, fragments of memories slipping through the haze of medication and exhaustion. He saw himself as a younger man, stepping into grand ballrooms, sealing multi-million-dollar deals with a handshake, standing at the pinnacle of success. But none of those moments were the ones his mind chose to linger on. Instead, he saw a lonely penthouse, empty dinner tables, a quiet house filled with echoes instead of voices. He had lived a life people envied, yet now, staring at the ceiling of a hospital room, he wondered if he had truly lived at all. His fingers trembled as they traced Charlie's fur, each stroke slower than the last. The golden retriever let out a soft whimper, nuzzling closer. He didn't understand sickness, didn't understand the beeping machines or the sterile smell of the hospital, but he understood one thing: Richard needed him. And so, he stayed. A doctor entered the room, glancing at the monitors before nodding solemnly at the nurse. Richard didn't have long. They had seen this before, the body surrendering, the quiet before the inevitable. The nurse felt a lump form in her throat. Richard shifted slightly, his strength fading, his vision blurred, the edges of the world softening, as though reality itself was growing tired. But in that moment, one thought anchored him, a single regret that weighed heavier than all the fortunes he had built. "I should have loved more," he whispered, barely audible. The nurse blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. But Charlie heard. The dog let out a soft breath, curling himself even closer to the man who had once seemed invincible. Richard had always believed love was a liability, a distraction from ambition. He had watched colleagues get swallowed by it, had seen it weaken men who were once powerful. So, he had built walls, high, impenetrable, cold. And yet, here he was, in his last moments, realizing that love was the only thing that had ever mattered. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the window like an urgent reminder that time was running out. The world would remember Richard Langley for his wealth, for his empire. But Charlie would remember the man who had once laughed as a golden puppy knocked over an expensive vase, the man who had begrudgingly let a dog sleep on his bed during a thunderstorm, the man who, despite everything, had needed love just like anyone else. The nurse wiped her eyes discreetly. She had seen many people die alone, but Richard wasn't alone. Not really. Charlie let out a soft, steady sigh and stayed by his side, refusing to move. This wasn't just a goodbye. This was a promise, a silent vow that, until the very last breath, he would stay. The hours dragged on, the quiet hum of the machines blending with the distant patter of rain against the hospital window. Richard Langley's breaths grew weaker, each inhale shallow, each exhale slower, as though his body was releasing its grip on the life it had once fought so ruthlessly to build. The doctor had spoken to the nurses in hushed tones, but the message was clear. There was nothing left to be done but wait. And so, Charlie waited. The golden retriever hadn't moved from his place beside the bed, his large, sorrowful eyes never leaving Richard's frail form. Occasionally, he let out a soft whimper, ears perking each time the old man stirred. It was as if he refused to believe that this was the end, that the man who had always been there, who had thrown tennis balls across sprawling lawns and grumbled about muddy paw prints on marble floors, was about to disappear forever. Outside the room, a conversation was taking place, one that Charlie, in his unwavering devotion, could never fully understand. Two men stood in the dimly lit hallway, their tailored suits a stark contrast to the pale green hospital walls. One of them, a younger man with sharp features and an air of impatience, glanced at his watch. The other, older but just as polished, sighed heavily. "This is a waste of time," the younger man muttered. "The lawyers have already sorted everything. We don't need to be here." "Respect, Daniel," the older man replied, though there was little conviction in his tone. "He was your uncle." "He was a selfish bastard," Daniel shot back, voice low but biting. "Didn't give a damn about family. Left everyone behind for his stupid empire. Now we're supposed to act like we care?" He scoffed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Let's just get the will finalized and move on." Inside the hospital room, Richard was unaware of the words being spoken just beyond the door. If he had known, perhaps he would have smiled bitterly. He had spent a lifetime keeping people at a distance, and now, even as he lay on the threshold of death, those who bore his last name treated him like a mere obligation. But Charlie didn't. The dog shifted, resting his head on the bed beside Richard's hand, his breathing steady and warm. It was a quiet, unshakable presence, one that neither demanded nor expected anything in return. Then, for the first time in what felt like hours, Richard stirred. His fingers twitched, brushing against the soft fur beneath them. A weak sound escaped his lips. Not quite a word, but something close to one. Charlie's ears perked. The nurse who had been checking the IV drip turned sharply. "Mr. Langley?" Richard's eyelids fluttered, and then, with what seemed like monumental effort, they opened. His vision was hazy, the world a blur of pale light and distant shapes. But there was one thing he could see clearly: Charlie. A faint smile ghosted his lips. The nurse leaned closer, her voice gentle. "Would you like some water?" Richard barely managed a slow shake of his head. His throat was too dry, his body too weak. But there was something else, something urgent, something that refused to be left unsaid. His lips parted, and this time, a whisper formed. "Charlie." The nurse's breath caught in her throat. Charlie let out a soft sound, shifting even closer. Richard's fingers curled slightly in the dog's fur. He struggled to keep his gaze steady, to push past the fog of exhaustion and pain. "Take care of him," he murmured. The nurse hesitated. "Who, Mr. Langley?" Richard exhaled shakily. "Charlie," he repeated, voice barely more than a breath. His grip on the dog tightened for the briefest moment before it loosened once more. Not them, not the lawyers. Understanding dawned in the nurse's eyes. Richard had built fortunes, had signed contracts worth millions, but in the end, his last wish wasn't for wealth or legacy. It was for Charlie, to ensure that the only soul who had never abandoned him wouldn't be left alone. The nurse swallowed hard. "I promise," she whispered. And with that promise lingering in the air, Richard's eyes closed once more. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain streaking the hospital windows in restless patterns. Inside the room, silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional beep of the machines monitoring Richard Langley's slowing heartbeat. The nurse remained by his side, her hands folded tightly together, as if grounding herself against the inevitable. Charlie, too, had not moved. The golden retriever's head rested on the edge of the bed, his deep amber eyes unwavering. He had never understood the concept of death, not in the way humans did, but he knew change. He knew the way the scent of a room shifted when sorrow filled it, knew the way Richard's voice had lost its strength, knew the way human hands trembled when something was about to be lost forever. In the hallway, Daniel checked his watch again. "How much longer?" he muttered, voice laced with impatience. The older man beside him sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're acting like this is an inconvenience." "It is," Daniel scoffed. "The old man never cared about us, and now we're supposed to sit here, waiting for him to die? I have meetings to attend." The older man shook his head, glancing through the small window in the hospital door. Not a single person in that room except the nurse. No wife, no children, no friends. His gaze softened, despite himself. "Except the dog." Daniel rolled his eyes. "It's pathetic." But when the nurse finally stepped out of the room, her expression pale and solemn, even he fell silent. She met their gazes and spoke words that had been inevitable from the start. "He's gone." The moment stretched, empty and meaningless. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair as if shaking off the weight of the moment. The older man, however, lingered, his attention flickering past the nurse, back to the open door of the hospital room. And there, still by the bedside, unmoving, was Charlie. The golden retriever hadn't lifted his head, hadn't moved an inch. He remained curled against Richard's arm, as if refusing to accept the absence that now filled the space between them. The nurse hesitated before stepping aside, allowing them in. Daniel barely spared the sight a glance, his focus already shifting to the next phase: legal matters, the will, the distribution of assets. But the older man, despite his years of dealing with wealth and estates, found himself unable to look away. Charlie did not understand lawyers. He did not understand inheritance. He did not understand that the world would now divide everything Richard Langley had built, piece by piece, as if his life had been nothing more than numbers on paper. All Charlie understood was loss. And so, he stayed. For minutes. For hours. Until the nurses eventually came to move him, whispering quiet reassurances as they led him away from the bed where his best friend now rested in stillness. The hospital room grew cold, empty of the man who had once filled it with a presence too powerful to ignore. But even in the silence, one truth remained. Charlie had been there when Richard had lived, and Charlie had been there when he had died. Because love, in the end, was the one thing that money could never buy. The rain had stopped by the time they took Richard Langley's body away. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the absence of the man who had once towered over it. Charlie sat in the corner of the hospital room, unmoving, his golden fur barely rising with each breath. He had not protested when the nurses had guided him away from the bed, had not whined or resisted when the scent of his owner faded from the sheets. Instead, he had simply sat, watching with quiet devastation as the only person who had ever mattered to him was taken from the room forever. Outside, in the fluorescent-lit hallway, the discussions had already begun. "So, what happens to the estate?" Daniel asked, arms crossed over his chest. His voice was void of grief, only laced with impatience. "I assume the lawyers will sort it out soon." The older man beside him, Jonathan Langley, Richard's distant cousin and business associate, exhaled slowly. Unlike Daniel, there was something unreadable in his expression, something that suggested he wasn't as unaffected as he pretended to be. "Yes, the will should be executed within the next few days." "Good," Daniel muttered, pulling out his phone. "I don't have time to waste." The nurse, who had been listening nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She knew the type, people who saw death as nothing more than a transition of assets, a momentary inconvenience in the grander scheme of their ambitions. But there was one thing they hadn't considered. She cleared her throat. "There's something else." Jonathan turned to her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the hospital room where Charlie still sat, eyes fixed on the empty bed. "Mr. Langley had a final request before he passed." Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "Let me guess, donate his wealth to charity?" He scoffed. "Not likely." "No." The nurse's voice was steady. "He asked for someone to take care of Charlie." At this, Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "The dog?" "Yes," she confirmed. "He was very clear. He didn't want Charlie going to just anyone. He specifically said, not the lawyers." For the first time, Daniel looked up, his expression twisted with disbelief. "You're telling me that, on his deathbed, the great Richard Langley's last concern was a dog?" The nurse's jaw clenched, but she kept her composure. It wasn't just a dog to him. Jonathan, on the other hand, looked thoughtful. His gaze flickered to the hospital room, where the golden retriever had not moved. A heavy silence followed. Then, Daniel scoffed. "Well, I'm certainly not taking it. I have no interest in playing babysitter for some mutt." He turned to Jonathan. "You like dogs. You take him." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's not that simple. I travel constantly, and I don't have time to—" Before he could finish, the nurse interrupted. "You should know, if no one takes responsibility for Charlie, he'll be sent to a shelter." Jonathan's head snapped toward her. A shelter. For a dog like Charlie, who had only known the warmth of Richard's home, who had spent years sleeping at the foot of a king-sized bed rather than a cold concrete floor, such a place would be unthinkable. Jonathan turned back toward the hospital room, and for the first time, as he stared at the dog curled up in silent mourning, something in his chest tightened. Jonathan Langley had never cared much for sentimentality. He was a businessman like Richard, sharp, pragmatic, efficient. He had spent his life making logical decisions, choices that were best for profit margins and long-term success. Taking in a grieving dog had never been part of that equation. Yet, as he stood in the doorway of the hospital room, watching Charlie remain frozen in place, he felt something he hadn't expected: guilt. Not just for Richard, who had died alone except for the dog beside him, but for Charlie himself, who did not understand what had happened, who only knew that his world had suddenly gone quiet. The golden retriever lifted his head slightly, ears perking, as if sensing Jonathan's presence. But when he saw that it wasn't Richard, his head lowered once more. Jonathan sighed. "Damn it." Daniel's voice broke through his hesitation. "Don't tell me you're actually considering this." Jonathan hesitated. "I don't know." Daniel groaned. "You realize how ridiculous this is, right? It's a dog, Jonathan. A Peter. He'll be fine in a shelter." Jonathan turned sharply. Would Richard have been fine in a nursing home? Daniel blinked, thrown off by the sudden comparison. "Because that's what a shelter is to a dog like him," Jonathan continued. "A place where he waits, hoping someone will come for him. But no one ever does." For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. He had never seen Jonathan this emotional before. Still, he rolled his eyes. "Fine. Do whatever you want, but don't expect me to waste my time on this." Jonathan ignored him, stepping into the hospital room. Charlie did not move. For a moment, Jonathan simply stood there, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, he crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the golden retriever. "Hey," he said softly. Charlie's eyes flickered toward him. Jonathan hesitated, then extended a hand. Charlie didn't react, didn't wag his tail, didn't retreat. He only stared, his eyes clouded with confusion. Jonathan exhaled. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "I know it doesn't make sense." Charlie let out a quiet whimper, his head resting against the cold tile floor. Jonathan swallowed hard. This wasn't just a dog. This was Richard's last companion, the only one who had stayed. With a final breath, he made a decision. He reached out, running a hand through Charlie's thick fur. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's go home." For the first time since Richard Langley had taken his last breath, Charlie moved. He lifted his head, and he followed. The car ride home was silent. Charlie sat curled in the passenger seat, his body still, his amber eyes locked on the window as the city lights blurred past. Jonathan stole glances at him between traffic lights, unsure of what to say. Not that the dog would understand words, but because he felt something gnawing at him, something close to guilt. Richard Langley had been a complicated man, impossible to truly know. But if there was one thing that had been clear, it was that this dog had meant everything to him. And now, in the aftermath of his death, Charlie was lost. Jonathan sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You're probably wondering what the hell is going on," he muttered, his voice unusually soft. "I get it." Charlie didn't move. The drive stretched on, the quiet between them thick with something Jonathan couldn't quite name. He had never owned a pet, never understood the bond that people had with animals. To him, dogs were just dogs. But Richard had never seen Charlie that way. And now, as he sat in this car with nothing but the weight of an unspoken promise, Jonathan realized that this was more than just taking in an animal. This was about responsibility. The rain had stopped by the time they pulled up to Jonathan's townhouse, a sleek, modern place that barely felt lived in. He had spent more nights in hotel suites than in his own home, and the thought of suddenly sharing it with another living soul, one that wouldn't ask for anything except to be loved, felt strangely unfamiliar. He turned off the ignition, but made no move to get out. Instead, he sat there, staring at the golden retriever who hadn't lifted his head since they left the hospital. Charlie wasn't asleep. He wasn't even resting. He was simply waiting. Jonathan exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. He had expected something different, maybe some resistance, maybe some small glimmer of gratitude. But instead, Charlie sat like a statue, his large amber eyes filled with quiet confusion. The dog was grieving. Jonathan hadn't considered that before. He had spent the entire drive thinking about his own obligations, his own discomfort, his own uncertainty about suddenly inheriting this creature. But he hadn't thought about what this meant for Charlie. Richard Langley had been his entire world, and now, just like that, he was gone. Jonathan swallowed against the unfamiliar tightness in his throat. "You don't have to like me," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "But I made a promise." Charlie didn't move. Jonathan sighed and opened the car door. He walked around to the passenger side and crouched down, hesitating before reaching out a hand. "Come on," he said softly. Charlie lifted his head slightly, but didn't move. His ears twitched, his nose flared, but there was no sign of recognition in his eyes, only exhaustion. Jonathan tried again. "I know this isn't home, and I know I'm not him." Charlie blinked slowly. "But I'm all you've got," Jonathan admitted. For a moment, he thought the dog wouldn't respond. But then, after a long silence, Charlie shifted. It wasn't much, just a slow, careful movement as he stepped out of the car, but it was enough. Inside, the townhouse felt colder than usual. The sleek, minimalist furniture, the polished marble floors, the expensive artwork, it was all lifeless. It had been designed for someone who had never planned to truly live there. Charlie took slow steps into the house, his nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents. He walked to the middle of the room and stopped. And then, he just stood there, waiting. Jonathan exhaled sharply. The sight of the dog, standing still, looking lost, it did something to him. "You don't know where to go, do you?" he murmured. Charlie turned his head slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't move. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah," he muttered. "Me neither." For the first time in years, Jonathan Langley didn't have an answer. He had spent his life making decisions based on logic, on strategy. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't just taking in a dog. He was taking in Richard's last wish, Richard's last piece of loyalty. And maybe, in some strange way, he was taking in a piece of himself that he had long buried, a part of him that had once known how to care for something other than wealth. He let out a breath. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the living room. Charlie hesitated for a second, then followed. It was small, but it was a start. The night stretched on in uneasy silence. Jonathan sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. Charlie lay curled up on the floor, staring at nothing. Every so often, he would lift his head, ears perking at some phantom sound, as if expecting Richard to walk through the door. It didn't happen. Jonathan didn't know what to do. He had never been good at comforting people, let alone a dog. But as he sat there, watching Charlie, something inside him cracked. He set the glass down, leaning forward. "You miss him, don't you?" he said softly. Charlie let out a slow breath. Jonathan hesitated, then reached out. He ran a tentative hand through the golden fur, half expecting the dog to pull away. But Charlie didn't move. Instead, for the first time all night he sighed, not in grief, but in something closer to exhaustion. Jonathan felt something in his chest tighten. This wasn't just about a promise. This was about two souls who had lost something. Maybe they weren't so different after all. And maybe, just maybe, they could figure out how to move forward together. Morning came slowly. Jonathan wasn't sure if he had slept at all. He had spent most of the night watching the city lights flicker through the window, listening to the quiet rhythm of Charlie's breathing. The dog hadn't moved much. He had stayed curled up near the couch, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of passing cars or the creaks of the empty townhouse. But each time, when no familiar voice called his name, he would lower his head again, his body sinking further into stillness. Jonathan felt helpless. He had no experience in grief. His way of dealing with loss had always been to bury it under work, under distractions, under anything that kept him from feeling it at all. But Charlie didn't have that option. Charlie had to feel it. Jonathan sighed and stood up, rubbing his temples. The morning light poured through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. He glanced down at the golden retriever, who hadn't moved. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Time to get up." Charlie didn't react. Jonathan hesitated, then crouched down and reached out a hand, giving the dog a small nudge. "Come on," he said, softer this time. Charlie blinked slowly but didn't move. Jonathan exhaled. He wasn't an emotional person. He wasn't good with comforting words or soft reassurances. But looking at the dog, so lost in his grief, he felt something shift inside him. "I know it hurts," he murmured, "but we have to keep going." Charlie let out a slow, quiet sigh. Jonathan frowned. This wasn't right. The dog hadn't eaten since yesterday, hadn't moved much, hadn't reacted to anything the way he was supposed to. He needed to do something. Grabbing his keys, Jonathan stood. "Come on," he said, a little firmer this time. "We're going out." Charlie didn't lift his head. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to convincing something, to keep going. But he had promised. He had promised Richard he would take care of him. And he wasn't about to fail. So he did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the leash Richard had left in a small box of Charlie's things, the only belongings Richard had passed on that weren't tied to money, contracts, or wealth. Just a simple worn-out leash that had been used 1,000 times before. Jonathan knelt beside Charlie, gently clipping the leash onto his collar. "Let's go," he said, quieter now. For the first time since they left the hospital, Charlie moved. It was slow, hesitant, but he shifted his weight, lifting his head to look at Jonathan. His ears twitched slightly, as if recognizing the sound of the leash. Jonathan's chest tightened. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." They stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the city alive with movement. Cars honked, people rushed past, and the world continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Charlie walked slowly beside Jonathan, his steps careful, his head low. He didn't pull on the leash, didn't wag his tail, but he walked, and that was something. They made their way through the city, past towering buildings and bustling sidewalks. Jonathan had no real destination in mind. He just wanted Charlie to move, to feel the world again. And then, without thinking, he found himself heading toward a familiar place. The park. The same park Richard used to take Charlie to every morning. Jonathan wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but something in him told him to go. As they reached the park's entrance, Charlie hesitated. His body stiffened, his ears twitching as he took in the scents, the sounds. Jonathan waited. Then, slowly, Charlie took a step forward, and another. And then, for the first time since Richard had passed, he lifted his head. It wasn't much, but it was something. The park was quiet that morning, the air still crisp from the fading remnants of night. A few joggers ran along the trails, some children laughed near the pond, and an elderly couple sat on a bench watching the world move around them. Jonathan hadn't been here in years, but Charlie had. The golden retriever stopped near a familiar spot, a shaded patch beneath a towering oak tree. Jonathan watched as Charlie sniffed the ground, his nose brushing against the fallen leaves. His tail didn't wag, but his posture changed, just slightly. Jonathan swallowed hard. "This was your place, wasn't it?" he murmured. Charlie didn't answer, but Jonathan didn't need one. He could see it in the way Charlie stood. How, for the first time since Richard had gone, he looked like he was searching for something, remembering something. Jonathan sat down on the bench near the tree, giving the dog space. He watched as Charlie moved, slow and careful, as if stepping through memories only he could see. Jonathan thought about Richard, about the man who had built an empire, only to realize too late that love, not wealth, was the only thing that mattered in the end. And about the dog who had been his only constant, the one soul who had never left his side. Jonathan exhaled. For so long, he had thought of Richard as a distant figure, a man too consumed by success to understand what it meant to truly live. But maybe he had been wrong. Maybe, in the end, Richard had understood more than any of them. Because Richard had chosen Charlie. He had chosen loyalty. Love. Not money, not power. Just love. And now, it was Jonathan's turn to do the same. Charlie lifted his head. For the first time, his eyes weren't filled with confusion. He took a step forward, then another, and before Jonathan could react, the golden retriever did something he hadn't done since Richard died. He ran. It wasn't fast, it wasn't playful, but it was something. Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched. Charlie ran to the tree, then paused, as if expecting to see someone there, waiting for him. But no one was. Slowly, Charlie sat down beneath the tree, his eyes scanning the park. Jonathan swallowed hard. He stood and walked over, crouching beside the dog. Charlie turned to look at him. Jonathan hesitated, then reached out, resting a hand against the golden fur. "I miss him too," he admitted. Charlie sighed, a deep, slow exhale. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, then let out a small, bitter chuckle. "You know, I never really got it. Why people get so attached to animals." Charlie blinked at him. "But I think I do now." Because it wasn't just about companionship. It was about loyalty. Unwavering, unconditional, endless loyalty. And maybe that was something Jonathan had been missing his whole life. Maybe that was something Richard had been trying to tell him all along. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a quiet stillness, a peace that Jonathan hadn't felt in years. Charlie let out another sigh and rested his head against Jonathan's knee. Jonathan didn't move. For the first time in his life, he just sat there, and for the first time in his life, he understood. Because love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about money or status or power. It was about being there. And as the sun broke through the morning clouds, Jonathan finally realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The weeks that followed were quiet, but something had shifted. Charlie no longer spent his days curled up in a motionless heap on the floor. He still had moments where he would stare at the door, ears twitching as if waiting for Richard's voice. But there were also moments where he moved, slowly, cautiously, toward something new. Jonathan noticed the changes, subtle at first. The way Charlie would follow him from room to room. The way he'd nudge Jonathan's hand when he sat in silence for too long, lost in his own thoughts. It was as if the dog had decided, hesitantly, reluctantly, to trust him. And Jonathan? He was learning. He learned that Charlie had a habit of sighing deeply before settling in for a nap, as if carrying the weight of an entire lifetime in his breath. He learned that Charlie didn't like the sound of sirens, that thunderstorms made his ears twitch, that he only ate when someone was in the room with him. And most of all, Jonathan learned what it meant to be needed. Not in the way his business partners needed him, not in the way financial deals depended on his decisions, but in the way another soul, one who couldn't speak, who had no way of asking for help, needed him to simply be there. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Jonathan woke to the sound of soft footsteps. He blinked blearily, disoriented for a moment, before realizing what had pulled him from sleep. Charlie. The golden retriever stood at the edge of the bed, staring at him with quiet expectation. Jonathan frowned. "What?" His voice was hoarse from sleep. Charlie's tail gave a slow, hesitant wag. It was the first time. Jonathan sat up, rubbing a hand down his face. He glanced at the clock. 6:14 a.m. Too early for anything reasonable. Charlie let out a small huff, stepping closer. Jonathan groaned. "You're serious?" Charlie's tail wagged again. "Just a little more this time." Jonathan sighed, throwing off the blanket. "Fine." They went to the park. It became a routine after that. Every morning, just as the city began to stir, Charlie would wake Jonathan, and they would go to the park. At first, it was just walking, slow steps, quiet moments beneath the same oak tree where Richard had once sat. But, over time, Charlie started running again, and Jonathan, without realizing it, started feeling something close to peace. One afternoon, as they returned from the park, Jonathan paused at the door. Charlie trotted past him, heading straight for the living room. Jonathan watched him go, a small smile tugging at his lips. This was home now, not just for him, for both of them. And somehow, that made all the difference. Life is not measured by wealth or success, but by the love we share and the connections we leave behind. Richard Langley's legacy wasn't in his empire. It was in the loyalty of a dog who never left his side. In the end, love is the only thing that truly remains. What would your final legacy be? Have you ever experienced a bond so unbreakable that it defied time and loss? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because some stories deserve to be remembered.